As you guys probably know, E28s are my favorite car on planet Earth, and in this episode, we're gonna take this one from a bone stock example to the perfect daily driver spec, and we're gonna do it on a budget. But this car isn't even my car. It belongs to the other half of StanceWorks, the man behind the camera. Give me that thing, come on.
What's up, everybody? My name is Anthony, and this is my E28. We've been working hard at it for the last couple months, and I'm excited because this is my first project car, and with the help of Mike, we're gonna change it from a super stock example to what it is now, so Mike's gonna rewind.
Some of you may remember back in February when I finished up my own E28 project, and then we capped it by taking an adventure out to Los Angeles to go car shopping for another one. After a bit of hunting, we found the perfect car for my cameraman, Anthony Pham. He joined the vintage BMW family with his first ever project car, and it's quite the car to start with. It's a 1987 535 5-speed. As mentioned in the last episode, this thing's got a lot of miles on it, and it is a little rough around the edges. It needs TLC, no two ways about it. But it's got good bones, it's got no rust, and it's everything that you want out of an E28 with none of the major headaches or hurdles. The best part of all, of course, is that we snagged this thing for just $4,000. That feels like a lot given what we paid for these things back when I was a kid, but these days it's one of the last good deals left out there. And so that brings us to today, nearly 6 months later, to see just what kind of progress Anthony has been making on his first project, and one that he's had some great helping hands to dive into. Myself, as well as the guys next door at Lightbow, have pitched in to help turn this E28 into what we consider to be the ultimate daily driver on a budget. As you might expect, this one's going to begin the night that we got the car. Given that this E28 has more than 250,000 miles on it, it needs a thorough once-over to figure out what it's going to need in order to make it a reliable daily. Because we somehow convinced Anthony it was a good idea to sell his relatively new Civic in favor of this thing.
So Anthony just got this new E28. We just checked it over in the air. The car's in really good shape. It's got a bunch of new parts changed on it. A lot of the common wear things on E28s have all been addressed already. One of the things we did notice was that the valve adjustment on these, which they've got adjustable rocker arms in the cylinder head, it's pretty noisy, and that's just common. They just wear out over time. So we're gonna take the valve cover off, check them, make sure there's no worn parts in there, adjust the valves, put it back together.
And thus marks Anthony's first time ever picking up a set of tools to work on a car of his own. But while a valve adjustment isn't fun to experience, what is starting to check off all of the small differences that'll make this car look the way that it should. And that starts with what is essentially a rite of passage: installing new roundels on an old BMW. Yeah, maintenance is important, but getting the car to look the part is a lot more enjoyable to undertake, so with the new roundels came new, fresh black trim pieces that go at the back of the hood. And these came off of a parts donor car that's been sitting in our parking lot for way too long. But finally, there's a worthwhile use for the thing, because otherwise there's not a worthwhile part on it. It's obvious to say, but it's these small touches that go a long way towards making a car look and feel a whole lot nicer, but a much bigger change comes in the form of a new front end. The United States Department of Transportation really screwed over E28s when it comes to the bumpers and their grille and headlight assemblies, but thankfully we've got the first piece to that puzzle right here.
Woo! Look at these bad boys. Woo! Nothing better than Euro converting your old classic BMW, baby. These look great. A little bit of cleanup, a little bit of back to black. It's gonna be really nice. Hell yeah. Alright, let's go.
To some, the difference is subtle, but to us BMW fans, the change in the overall headlight assembly is a big one. Euro E28s came with 7-inch outer headlights, and it completely transforms the way the front end of the car looks. Not to mention the fact that Euro headlights aren't sealed beams, which means you can upgrade things like light bulbs or even swap over to HIDs if you are so inclined. In Anthony's case, we're going to stick with the old H1s and H4s. This is largely an aesthetic upgrade. So we need to get to work cleaning up the parts and seeing what we're really working with. LikePal's parts washer worked wonders on these parts, but it's typically meant for cleaning up grimy metal, not plastic. And we want to do something about getting this black plastic to restore to its original dark, lustery finish. And the best solution for that is to get it scuffed up and throw some fresh trim paint on it. As for the install, thankfully these parts are a bolt-on affair, aside from the wiring. It does take a little bit of work behind the scenes to get everything to plug in and work properly, but we skipped over that in favor of keeping this episode at least somewhat interesting. So, for what's important, it's a few screws, a few clips, and everything bolts in, and as said, completely changes the way that this car looks. This truly is the way that E28s should have come from the factory worldwide. These days, there's a long list of things I don't forgive BMW for, but this is probably the first one. Second on that list, of course, is the fact that these cars should have Euro bumpers as well, and we're going to touch on that later in the episode, as that's one of the big changes this car still needs. But it wouldn't be true E28 ownership if we also didn't make Anthony run his car into a wall to tuck these bumpers, and that's coming later in the episode, so we'll at least make some progress in that regard. But first, let me tell you guys about today's episode sponsor, Factor. Whether we're here in the shop slamming trying to get cars done, or if we're trying to edit up our episodes, sometimes it's hard for us to find time to go out and eat something healthy or to make our own lunch. We hit a lot of drive-thrus here in the StanceWorks shop, but Factor is the ultimate way to solve that problem. We can eat better, cheaper, and save a ton of time doing it. Factor is a subscription-based meal delivery service, and they offer 35 different dietitian-designed, pre-made meals that are delivered to you every week. They're never frozen, and they're easy to cook, only 2 minutes in the microwave, and you're ready to go. In the shop, thanks to Factor, we're able to now spend less time worrying about what we're going to eat, or worse yet, how unhealthy it's inevitably going to be, and instead can eat something delicious and low-calorie so we can get back to work building these awesome cars. You guys know that with any advertisement I do here on the StanceWorks channel, it's only for things that I would actually endorse myself and truly use, and I'm happy to say Factor 75 is actually worth trying. We've been using it here in the shop. It tastes good, it's made by dietitians, it's cooked by chefs, this stuff is never frozen, it's fresh, and it's genuinely worth trying out. If you want to try it too, head to factor75.com and use StanceWorks50 as your checkout code for 50% off of your first box and 20% off of your next month's order. Again, that's code StanceWorks50 for 50% off of your first box and 20% off of your next month's order. Go try it now, there's a link in the description. Restoring old cars like these can be a war of attrition. It requires tackling lots of little things slowly and over time before you really get to see the big picture. And in this case, it's a single, simple, broken taillight that can make all the difference on the tail end of Anthony's car. He managed to snag these for $120, which brings our running parts total so far for all of our upgrades to $780. With the taillights out of the car for replacement, it also offered a good opportunity to bring in a PDR expert to fix some of the dents scattered around the car. This was the most expensive step so far at $600, but again, completely transformative. If you notice, there's a handful of dents, especially a big one that sits above the front passenger door handle, but our PDR guy was able to take care of everything and had this car looking as good as new. The icing on the cake would be to have our friend Gustavo give it a full paint correction, but that's later on the list and we didn't fit it into this episode. Now, I know some of you are probably getting bored. We've got to up the ante if I want to hold your attention, so I'm happy to say at this point, we start pivoting towards the good stuff. Anthony was cruising Facebook Marketplace when he found an incredible set of 16-inch ARE mesh wheels, measuring out to 16 by 9. Woo, look at those!
Yeah,
hell yeah.
Super chill. Met in the T-Mobile parking lot.
Nice.
Great.
Dude, Anthony, check them out, dude. Those are gonna be sick. These are the most expensive part of the build at $1,400, but they're well worth it given how crazy the wheel market is today. I'd say these were an incredible find. They do need some TLC though, so we whipped out some metal polish and got to work the good old-fashioned way with some microfiber cloths. One wheel was missing a center cap, so tack on another $30 thanks to eBay so that we could track down a new one. With the center cap on hand and the lips polished up, these wheels are looking incredible, but there's still one factor that needs to change, and although they came with tires, these are too small for an E28. So we're gonna have to change them out for something a little bit more substantial. So we called up our friends at Falcon Tire. This time, we requested a set of 225/50 R16 RT615K Plus Azenas tires. As always, Eric from Rocco's Wheel and Tire brought his mobile tire setup to the shop to swap everything out for us. I know that having a mobile tire guy isn't something most people have access to, especially given how rural parts of this country can be, but I definitely don't miss having to load up wheels and tires and head down to the local tire shop, because these days Eric just makes it happen right here, no wait, no headache, and to say this is a game changer for how often we have to do stuff like this is an understatement. So look around and see if maybe there's a mobile tire guy near you, because this is an amazing service, or if you're in SoCal, just call Eric at Rocco's Wheel and Tire because he's the man. Anyone out there that's dealt with 16-inch wheel and tire packages anytime in the last maybe 10 years knows how few and far between good 16-inch tire sizes can be. Picking the right sizing combo to fit on this wheel and then of course under the car was a challenge, but the 225/50 will fill the wheel wells out nicely and should have the same overall dimension as the 17-inch Alpinas on my E28 at the beginning of the video, but with a chunkier overall look and a little bit more comfort for that daily driver status. Now of course we want to put the wheels on, but we need coilovers to do that. And we're waiting on those to show up, so in the interim, we're going to tackle a stereo install, which, to be clear, is one of the few automotive things that is not in my wheelhouse. In fact, I've never even actually done it, so we called up my friend Jeremy, who's been in the automotive stereo business for the last 15 years, to lend at least somewhat of a helping hand. We're swapping to this VDO Continental unit that's increasingly popular, mostly because it isn't ugly, it makes good sound, and it has Bluetooth compatibility, which is critical. The problem, though, is that even if Jeremy knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, I'm not sure it's fair to say either of us have any actual idea what on earth we're doing.
How confident are you feeling right now?
Pretty good.
Okay.
You know I did this for a living. So the issue we're having today is my E28 is down, and I'm struggling to find an E28 wiring photo because Google has it so blurry it's hard to read. We might be able to make this work. Anthony, we got to talk about this. You see this panel under here? Yours is actually up right now. Don't take that panel off unless you absolutely have to. Allie drove my car the other day and caught her foot on it and yanked it down, and I spent a lot of time getting it partially back.
We're leaving that in.
Yeah, that's staying in. Sorry, Allie.
Sorry, Allie. Well, I had her do it without, this is old car stuff, but I had her do it without moving the seat because I was worried the seat may not go back into place. So I'm 6'3" and she's 5'6", so it's kind of on me. All right. Anthony, do you trust me? Is that a yeah? I think I saw him nod.
I don't think you trust yourself right now, dude.
Well, it's cut once, measure twice. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's a worse.
What side of that are you just cut them? Yeah.
We're just trying to get to a base. These wires. So.
What's the worst that can happen? Does have a working radio?
Yeah. Yes.
Unfortunately, nobody makes any sort of off-the-shelf adapter for these old cars, and so we're forced to wire it in the old-fashioned way.
All right, so here's the thing for anybody at home watching me use these plastic insulated crimps. And I know, I can tell, you think you're better than me with your uninsulated crimps and your heat shrink tubing.
There's two types of people. There's people that use these for the radio wiring, and there's people that lie about using these for the radio wiring.
So,
or you have too much time on your hands.
Get off your high horse and go comment on a different YouTube video right now. See, if I were
thinking about this as I did this. I would cut all of these to different lengths so that all of the crimps kind of stacked nicely instead of just one big bunch of them. But it's not my car.
You're not going to do it different on your car either. We're going to re-strip 4 wires to make it nicer. That's crazy.
I know, it's hard to believe, but eventually, through sheer determination, we did get this stuff figured out and wired in. And I'm not going to say that it's my best work or anything that I'm proud of, but the radio did go in and it does turn on, and honestly, I don't think you could really ask for much more than that, other than maybe for it to also produce sound, which it did not do. Personally, I would call that a small detail, but Anthony said he would prefer it to work, so we dove into the next part of this and installed new speakers down in the footwells of the car, along with all new wiring to each side so that we knew everything worked, and also because we still don't really know what we're doing and how to include the factory speaker wiring into that head unit to make them work. So we'll call it a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. With new wires and new speakers, though, the radio did kick on, connected to Bluetooth, and we can call this job done as well. But that does bring us to the E28's largest pitfall, its fuse box. We had some weird electrical issues where the radio was shutting off while Anthony was driving the car, and I knew in my heart of hearts that it had to be because of this. The E28's fuse box uses these old Bosch torpedo-style fuses, and anybody familiar with them knows that they're garbage. Not to mention the fact that the E28's fuse box just isn't all that well designed, and the spades that hold these fuses love to corrode and weaken up and just not clamp effectively. So if you're having any sort of electrical trouble on one of these cars, I promise you this is where it's coming from. It used to be that sorting this out was a nightmare because you'd have to swap out the entire box with one from another car and hope that it was going to be better. But these days, Holy Grail Labs actually sells a kit that retrofits into the E28 fuse box and updates it to modern blade-style fuses, along with modern circuitry and LEDs to tell you when stuff stops working, so on and so forth. I'm not an electrical engineer, but I can tell you this stuff is incredible and worth swapping in, and so that's exactly what we're going to do. But as you can see, swapping out the fuse box in an E28 is a full-blown electrical nightmare. It requires unpinning every single fused connection in the car from the fuse box and then redoing it all back the way that it was before without mixing any of it up. This small 40-year-old piece of cardboard is our roadmap to putting everything back together. Looking at it doesn't make a ton of sense, but in short, it tells us what color wires go into what positions, as long as you're not colorblind, and as long as this piece of paper hasn't had any water damage or been burned up by faulty electronics. The real challenge, though, is the fact that in order to swap in the new electronics, every single pin must be pried out of the fuse box, and when I say they don't want to come out, it's an understatement. The fuse box has to get mangled in order to get it down to its basic plastic core. But once stripped down, we can put in the new electronics, and as mentioned, this is the new circuit board from Holy Grail Labs. And this was supposed to go in my personal car, but I sold it before I got the chance to use it, so Anthony's going to reap the benefits of the upgrade. With a few modifications to the fuse box itself, the board drops into place, and then essentially it's just the reverse of disassembly. Although, of course, we have to take a lot of time, and I have to look at a lot of photos that I took to make sure everything goes back together properly. If we get this wrong, all sorts of systems inside of the car may not work at all, or worse yet, we could cause a fire, and we definitely don't want that. Despite goofing around with the radio, I've got a lot of experience with 12-volt systems and wiring for cars, so this task wasn't too daunting. But I definitely say to anybody trying to tackle something like this for their first time, proceed with caution, because it's a big job. Thankfully, it worked out fine on our end. Everything works on Anthony's E28, and ever since, the wiring gremlins have been gone. Now back to those pesky US diving board bumpers. As you can tell, they stick off the front and back of this car an alarming amount, to the point where they've earned the nickname diving boards. Our cars have these because the United States decided that all cars back in the 80s needed what they called 5-mile-per-hour impact bumpers. This, unfortunately, was BMW's solution, And while we're going to swap them out for better bumpers later, right now we're going to drill out the shocks and tuck the bumpers so they at least look better in the interim.
It's gonna have to go through 2 layers of metal. Woo. Oh!
Drilling out the shocks allows the shock fluid inside of them to escape, and that allows us to compress the bumper shocks down, therefore pushing the bumpers closer to the body itself. In my experience, having done this a number of times in the past, it seems as though some of the E28 bumper shocks are filled with this liquid, while some are actually filled with a foam, which can be a lot more difficult to compress. But in our case, all 5 bumper shocks on this car are filled with liquid. While Khalil worked on the rear shocks, Byron dove in and did a little bit of hammer and dolly work to try to straighten out the rear valence, which was only mildly successful. But what went better was repairing the rear exhaust mounts. Surprisingly, the exhaust was barely hanging on, so Byron added one more mount to the rear to stabilize it and secure it properly. With the shocks drilled out and the exhaust squared away, we can put the car back down on the ground, move it outside, and begin the process of compressing the bumper shocks. And this is where things get rather humorous. Yeah, I'm sure there are better ways to do it, but in a way, it's actually tradition to simply take the E28 and run it into a wall. Yes, I'm serious. We're going to crash the car into the side of the shop, in very slow motion, to be clear. Trying to hammer the bumper in simply won't work, and it's hard to get this much torque on it, and why not just use the car to our advantage? Just like that, one side is compressed, and we can focus on the other side to get everything tucked into place.
Is it even? Pretty even. Let's go! It's like 2009 all over again.
The rear bumper is more or less the same process, but we have to do it in the shop door opening to avoid running the exhaust into the wall. And it's a little bit trickier because there's a center shock on this thing, but all in all, if you get both sides to go in, it typically works pretty well, but it is mildly more time consuming.
It's trying to push it. See, it's like...
After a number of run-ins with the wall, we got the bumpers compressed, and I'm happy to say the car looks a lot better. And I know some of you are thinking it didn't really help, but this looks better than it did originally and pulls probably 3 or 4 inches off of each end of the car. And if you can't afford the several $1,000s it costs to buy the Euro bumpers, this is a great alternative. We're going to go that direction in the future, but for the time being, we're going to stick with the US bumpers, and while we're at it, we're going to add an IS air dam. This factory body kit component is a really good way to get the front of the car a bit more filled out and closer to the ground without having to lower it so much so that it can't be driven. If you ask me, this piece belongs on all US E28s because it drastically changes the way that it looks and fixes that kind of overbite issue they tend to have from the factory. This particular air dam, though, clearly needs a lot of work, and we've got to paint it because it's black. Now, you guys know I don't like doing things the wrong way, but there are enough flaws on this air dam that doing it the correct way would require a lot of work, and we're considering this air dam as a temporary part, so we're going to leave some of its flaws and just blast it with paint. It doesn't need to be perfect. Although, between you and me, I wouldn't have asked Khalil to do the bodywork on it because, well, he doesn't know what he's doing, as evidenced by the fact that he's taking a die grinder to the air dam. Anthony didn't know any better at the time because he's new to cars, and I'm only learning about it because I'm watching this footage and editing the episode. But just like you guys, I am screaming on the inside because this is absolutely unhinged when it comes to any form of bodywork whatsoever. But we'll just have to run with it, and I won't recommend Khalil to anybody when it comes to bodywork in the future. The saving grace here, though, is, as said, this is a temporary part for this car, and it also sits low to the ground underneath the front end, so it's not really a focal point. White tends to hide flaws pretty easily, so that's working in our favor. And last but not least, it's not any worse than it was before, and these things tend to be pretty haggard, so I guess it's better than nothing. They let it dry for a few days and then passed it on to me, where Anthony and I did a little bit of cleanup and hit it with a couple more coats of paint and then tackled it with clear. Now again, I'm not going to say that the job is great, but after hitting it with some clear coat, it's not too bad. The clear laid on nicely, and for being an aerosol job, I think it suffices. It looks pretty good on the car as a finished product, and again, being temporary, none of it really matters once we put Euro bumpers on this thing, hopefully in the next few months. We're close to installation, but the clear coat needs to cure up, and so in the interim, it's finally time to install those coilovers we talked about. Anthony's E28 is on old stock suspension, and we want to bring it closer to the ground and firm up the ride, and thankfully we've got a spare set of coilovers lying around because we recently pulled our friend Jeremy's car apart and upgraded to H&R coilovers, and we've got these hand-me-downs to throw on for the time being until Anthony earns a set of H&Rs himself. We are going to install brand new camber plates and rear shock mounts, so we'll add those to our parts total, and we also need to put new hubs on it because everything's apart and it would be silly to try to install the old ones. There's no telling what I was busy with at the time, so Khalil decided to hop in and do the install for Anthony, and given that he's done this as many times as I have, he knocked it out in a matter of a couple of hours. The most time-consuming part, of course, is just dialing in the ride height so the car sits the way we want it to, which comes at the end. Perhaps the most common criticism that E28s get from enthusiasts is the fact that it has a steering box instead of a steering rack, and I'll admit it's probably one of the biggest drawbacks, but a well-set-up E28 still drives beautifully, especially once you get decent suspension underneath it. I think Anthony's going to be really surprised by what suspension's going to do for this car, even considering that these rear shocks are actually blown, and we're going to have to make another upgrade to H&Rs in the future. But with the suspension installed, we can finally start test fitting our wheels and tires, and they're going to look good, but it's clear we've got to roll the fenders. And anyone who's rolled E28 fenders knows this is where 3 different pieces of sheet metal meet, and it's no easy task. We used a lot of heat to make sure we didn't crack the paint, and I'm happy to say it went really well. We got enough room and had no paint problems, which is a rarity on cars this old. And it gives me confidence that once we do a paint correction on this thing, it's going to look like $1 million. After playing around with some H&R spacers, we got our fitment dialed in and messed with the ride height so the car sat the way we want it to. And now it's on the ground and time for that final roll out of the shop so everyone can get a good look at the finished product. I'm sure a lot of you guys know that incredible sensation of setting a car down on wheels and suspension after an install. But there's something truly special about feeling that for the very first time, and in this case, that goes for Anthony. He's never even had wheels or suspension or a car like this, and so getting to pull it out of the shop and get that first impression was a monumental moment and made all the more special by the fact that plenty of his friends were around to experience it with him. Of course, it needs a test drive to make sure that everything clears and there's no rubbing, especially since Anthony doesn't have experience in this regard, so I took it around the block, and I'm happy to report back there's no rubbing whatsoever. This car is dialed and ready for daily driver duty, but we will have to give Anthony a crash course on how to drive a lowered car so he doesn't blow the oil pan off of this thing the first time he encounters a speed bump. At this point, I think it's safe to say we are rounding third and on the home stretch. The finishing touch, of course, is to install that air dam now that the paint has had time to cure up. One problem, though, is that the factory bracket to hold this thing on just isn't gonna fit. The valance is mangled, the bracket is twisted, and the factory bumper is split in 3 different places, so we're gonna have to break some rules and install the air dam directly to the bumper. It doesn't really look different from the way that it would be stock, but I know there are some E28 guys out there that are gonna be upset about it, and you guys are just gonna have to deal with it. After all, you gotta remember,
It's not my car.
But even still, I don't want to cut corners, so we installed riv nuts into the factory bumper so it could bolt on in the most proper way possible. When we upgrade and convert to Euro bumpers, all of these parts will be disappearing, so it doesn't really matter. With that done, there is one final touch. Every car needs an air freshener, and this one comes from our friend Aidan Templin. If you aren't familiar, go check him out. I'll put a link in the description. He produces some awesome BMW content, and if you like this episode, you will love what he does too. But with that, we're done. It's time for the reveal. I've got to say that I think Anthony has done an absolutely incredible job with this car. Even I would be enthusiastic to call it my own. As far as daily drivers go, I think that this is as good as it gets, and it leaves me feeling heartbroken that I recently sold my E28, but at least I get to see this pull into the parking lot every single day. This is such a cool car to see as somebody's first ever project, and thankfully Anthony has some good people around him to help guide him in the right direction. And honestly, as far as first projects go, I don't know anyone who's had something cooler, and yeah, I might be biased, but still, I mean, look at this thing. But what I want to drive home most, though, is what he's had to spend to achieve it. Including the purchase price of the car and a few miscellaneous details I didn't include in this episode, he has spent a total of $7,568. And yeah, I know there are some freebies in there, but even if we include the value of those, he's still under 10 grand for something as special as this. And he's been daily driving it for 6 months without a hiccup. Or at least no hiccups big enough that I've had to go pick him up. This car turned out beautifully, and I hope you guys have enjoyed seeing it come together, and we'll be back with more updates in the future as long as you've enjoyed the process. And there you guys have it. That is Anthony's E28. It's been a bunch of fun to get it to this point, but obviously it's nowhere close to done. If I have any say in this project car, even though it's not mine, it's gonna wind up engine swapped or turboed or something of the sort. We've still got to touch up the interior, maybe find some nicer sport seats. We've got suspension revisions to make. We got to get some H&R coilovers on this thing, so on and so forth. It's never gonna be done, but that is part of the fun of this thing. And that's also been part of the fun of staying budget conscious on this thing and not just throwing every bit of money that we can at it. And I'm hopeful that this episode has been a fun change of pace. You guys kind of get to see what is going on behind the scenes and just another approach to these cars that we love. So again, thanks to Anthony for letting us put his project car on the channel too. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll catch you guys next week for the next one.